Who knows anything about Cliffnotes? Have you ever, you know what Cliffnotes are? If you got to college before, they were kind of like those things that it's like, yes, I got the answers in the back of the book now. I'm going to be okay. They actually started in 1958 by a man named Clifton. And when it started, it was actually Cliff's apostrophe S notes. But later on, they just dropped the apostrophe S and just made it Cliff Notes. And then, to me, if I recall, you know, this is back in the 80s when I was going to college, there was a small bright yellow book. So it was kind of like those police warning, crossing tape sort of thing. That's how bright they were, okay? So, and it's like, yes, I'm gonna make it through college. I have the Cliff Notes. But they started in 1958. Oh, yeah. Shout out to Cliff out there. Clifford, he's got, you know. But 1958, he was a textbook distributor. And they started in a very humble beginnings in the basement of a house in Lincoln, Nebraska. Anybody ever been to Nebraska? But it was originally intended to be condensed study guides for Shakespearean plays. So I guess a lot of people back then were reading the Shakespeare, and so they go, well, this doesn't make any sense. I better figure out what they're talking about. And so they grabbed the Cliff Notes. By 1964, it had sold more than 1 million copies annually. So they were really on a roll. Finally went on in 1999, back when the internet was invented, or around there, I don't know when, but that's when it went online. And it got me thinking, and I was thinking about Cliff Notes. You know, my mind thinks kind of weirdly sometimes. I thought, well, Jesus is taking his disciples up the mountain. He's probably going to, you know, get near a cliff. We better find the Cliff Notes. And I asked myself, are there Cliff Notes for the Bible? You ever think about Cliff Notes for the Bible? Wouldn't it be nice? Maybe we should, instead of passing out the Bible, maybe we should pass out the Cliff Notes of the Bible, so people don't have time to read anymore. So let's pass that out, and hopefully it hits the major themes. Okay? If I were to ask somebody out there, and I'm not going to pick on anybody. I'd like to pick on somebody, but I won't, because I try to be a good pastor. But what would be the major theme? If you were, maybe I would pick on somebody. The major theme of the Bible. I'm going to go to Lily. I'm going to put Lily on the spot. She just came back from Indianapolis, so she's not going to be ready for this. But Lily, what would you say the major theme of the Bible is? Or don't look at your brother. Don't look at your... Huh? What would you say? Because you've been doing a lot of, you've been doing that Bema podcast, and I don't know how many hours you put into this. So overall, what would you say the overall theme of? See, I'm trying to get some life and energy in here. Yes, go. Of course, God acting in history, and God connecting with people, and God showing the way for salvation, right? This is God's. So I'm going to have to check out the Cliff Notes. But, if you have commentaries at home, they're probably the same idea. They kind of help you interpret, understand it. But this morning, I want to give it the old college try. You ever hear that phrase, give it the old college try? In an attempt to assign reason and meaning to the transfiguration. I assume that most of us know what the meaning of the transfiguration, as far as some idea of what we're talking about. And it is recounted in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And even Peter specifically refers to the transfiguration in his second letter when he writes the following. He says, "We do not follow cleverly invented stories about when we were told about the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus, but we were," it says, "eyewitnesses of His majesty. For we received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to Him from," and this is interesting, I've read the Bible quite a bit, and I never recalled, Peter says he calls God majestic glory. I never really caught that before. He says, "A voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, 'This is my Son, whom I love, and him I am well pleased.'" And Peter goes on, he says, "We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain." Now, at first you might think, well, that was the baptism of Jesus, right? Yes, the voice God spoke during the baptism of Jesus and said something very similar, but he is referring to the time when Jesus took Peter, James, and John to Mount Horeb. I think that's what there's a couple different, scholars are kind of debating between two different places where this might have been, but Mount Horeb seems to be the place. So needless to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that the transfiguration event, as recorded in the Bible, was an extremely important event. And to be fair, saying that it is extremely important really doesn't even begin to tell half the story. It was very important. As a matter of fact, it was more than important. I would say it was life-altering. It was life-altering for these three men that witnessed it: Peter, James, and John. Maybe not immediately life-altering, maybe not immediately life-changing, because I think when it happened, they were pretty much shell-shocked and dumbfounded. They were so shocked by it, they didn't even know how to respond or react to it, to be honest with you. Peter said some crazy things, and even one of the gospel writers write that they fell face down. But they were changed in ways that they probably didn't even understand or realize until probably much later in their lives. This can happen to us as well. We can have life-altering experiences, life-changing things. For example, I'm going to give you a couple examples here. A woman gives birth to a baby, and even though she is overjoyed in the moment, bringing this new life into the world, she still has no inkling as to how or to what degree that child will change her life. It's one of those great mysteries of life, and trying to describe it with words can seem almost impossible. Perhaps like trying to describe the transfiguration. The same can be said for a man that becomes a father for the first time. To understand and appreciate the fact that he is now responsible for another human being that he helped bring into this world, that can be very humbling and an awe-inspiring moment. It can change a man from within the deepest part of who he is. But he may not be aware of that change until much later in his life, when he finally has time to reflect upon that privilege of being a father. Now, some of you might want to disagree with my assertion that the transfiguration was a life-altering event, especially in light of the fact that just a few chapters later, Peter is very adamant about denying that he even knows Christ. So we're in Mark chapter 9, but in Mark chapter 15, just a few chapters later, Peter's going to say, I do not know that man. And he even curses at the people who asked the question. But if we are honest with ourselves, we can all, I think, recall life-altering events that have significantly changed us. But that doesn't mean that we, after the life-altering event, that somehow we operate 100% of the time from that new perspective. Because when we have a life-altering event, we do have a new perspective on life. I was just talking to my college buddy, my college roommate. He lives in Montana. He's kind of going through a transition right now, but he just found out that his brother, he was riding a motorcycle and hit a deer. Okay, so he's in the hospital now trying to recover. So it's like a motorcyclist's worst nightmare is to go out there and run smack into a large animal. Okay, so that could be a life-altering event for him. I don't know. I mean, he's still in the hospital. We'll find out. But he's not. His brother really isn't we can pray for him. His name is Scott. But he's back in Wisconsin. There's lots of deer in Wisconsin. Probably not as many in Michigan, I don't think, though. But anyway, I experienced a life-altering event back in 1984 when I became a Christian. But that doesn't mean that I've always lived up to the Christian standards that God has had for me. Actually, far from it. But my life's trajectory overall, my life's trajectory has constantly been one that points heavenward since that moment. Yeah, there might be some ups and downs. It's kind of like the stock market, right? It kind of goes up and down a little bit, but eventually it keeps going up, I hope. But that's how I feel about my life, that God is taking me heavenward. And it started way back, even before that, but I made that decision in 1984. And perhaps you can look at your life that your life has never been the same when you finally were confronted with the truth of the gospel. And you receive that word into your mind and into your heart. And so your trajectory is always going up towards God. The Apostle Paul, while on the road to Damascus to harm and destroy the fledgling church, had a life-altering experience, didn't he? When he encountered the resurrected Lord, and then from then on, the trajectory of his life was radically altered. You would agree with that, wouldn't you? He went from being a persecutor of God and the church to the church's greatest missionary. But that doesn't mean that through Paul's life that he never wrestled with thoughts of doubt and fear and despair. In fact, what it does mean is that whatever Paul encountered after the meeting of the risen Lord, he now viewed it through a completely new lens that sought to magnify God's love and mercy and grace. That's what Paul wanted to do. All the same stuff that God revealed to him on the road and bestowed upon him. There's a reason that the Apostle Paul exhorted us to walk in the Spirit and not the flesh. Because we have a tendency, as members of the fallen human race, we gravitate. It's a natural tendency for us to gravitate to unbelief, and to doubt and sin. It's like water seeking the lowest level. And it's only by God's Spirit, by His powerful Spirit, that He protects and brings us wisdom and love, that we will rise to the higher heights of what He wants for us. Holiness and purity, godliness. And so Mark tells us here in Mark chapter 9, the beginning of chapter 9, tells us that Jesus led Peter, James, and John up a high mountain. And where they found themselves, I'm not sure if it actually says they got to the peak of the mountain, but they were high up in the mountain. They found themselves all alone, at least for a moment. And then things got pretty crazy, didn't they? Mark writes that Jesus was transfigured before them, and that His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. Matthew writes that His face shone like the sun, and His clothes became as white as the light. And Luke says that the appearance of His face changed. His clothes became as bright as lightning, as a flash of lightning. So here we read in these three accounts, these three different depictions of the same event, which differ slightly in detail, but they do differ. And maybe this is due to the fact that the gospel writers were describing something that, quite frankly, is almost indescribable, and something that they didn't personally witness. None of these guys, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, they weren't there to witness this, and so they're relying on others to describe it for them. And so we don't want to get bogged down or dwell obsessively on all the tiny details. Obviously, the transfiguration of Christ did happen, and it left a permanent and indelible mark on these three men. That we are sure of. And so the bigger question becomes not, did it happen? But the question is, why? Why did it happen? What was God's intention for this event? The transfiguration. And I don't think we can adequately answer this question until we picked up on some critical clues from events that happened directly before the transfiguration, namely 6 days before that, because it says, Mark makes a comment, after 6 days, Jesus led them up the mountain. And so what were those things? First, 6 days earlier, Peter recognizes Jesus as the Messiah and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He says that. And Jesus says to him, "Blessed are you, Peter, for this has not been revealed to you by men, but has been revealed to you by heaven." And number two, Christ, right after that, Christ says the prophetic words directly thereafter concerning his imminent suffering and rejection and death on the cross. He mentions that. So after Peter makes this wonderful, great confession, all of a sudden Jesus drops a bomb on them and says, "Yes, I am the Messiah," basically agreeing, "and now you need to know that I am going to die." And three, and this is important too, Jesus makes his clarion call to the crowd to follow him wholeheartedly, without reserve, even unto death. Those are three major things that happened just before Christ led Peter, James, and John up the mountain. You see, when we combine these three events together and top it off with Jesus' incredible claim, he says that some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power. And when we put these all together, we should not be at all surprised that Christ would then reveal his deity and his majesty in such a dramatic way to his inner circle of friends. Because that's who Peter, James, and John are. Obviously, on one hand, they were totally surprised, right? Matthew writes, upon hearing God's voice, because a cloud came upon them, and hearing God's voice, they fell face down to the ground and were terrified. You see, these were ordinary men who just witnessed something completely extraordinary, the glorification of their friend and teacher, their rabbi. So on one hand, we should not be at all surprised. But at the same time, we shouldn't be all that surprised, because God knows how fickle and frail and feeble we are when it comes to believing in him and acting out our beliefs and observing our beliefs. That is the dilemma of mankind. We want to believe. Remember the one father who has the demon-possessed son. He says, "I do believe. Help me with my unbelief." That is the boat that we all find ourselves in a lot of times. We want to believe. We do believe. And yet we need God's help to believe. What I'm saying is, if we are somehow going to follow and trust God for our future, even unto the point of death, that's what Christ is calling us to, that we must follow him, even willing to die for him and the gospel. If Jesus is calling us to do that, which he does, like in Mark 8:34, when he says, "If anyone would come after me," and this is just before Peter, James, and John is led up the mountain with Jesus, Jesus says to them, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself. He must take up his cross and follow me." And my point is, if God expects me to do that, he needs to somehow give us a glimpse of not only what is to come, but grant us a behind-the-scenes look of who he is. And I believe that has a lot to do with the transfiguration. It's all about God understanding exactly who he's dealing with, his people. He understands the predicament we find ourselves in, because we are weak and feeble and frail, and we have a hard time believing. And he also understands clearly in his mind his plan for humanity's salvation. And he needs to communicate to these three men who are going to be the leaders of this fledgling church. You see, God called all those people. And here's this interesting thing. God looked around at the crowd, and the disciples were in the crowd, and he called the crowd to him just in Matthew chapter 8, Mark chapter 8. And these people were there because they were following him because they wanted to be healed. They wanted to be fed. They wanted to be saved. And he calls them, what did he call them? You wonderful people? No, he called them an adulterous and sinful generation. That's kind of a slap in the face. But that's the truth. And sometimes the truth hurts. And that is what they were. That is what they were, and that is who we are today. We are an adulterous and sinful generation. And since this is who we are, since we are a broken and unbelieving generation, and of course you just have to, you don't have to go too far to find that out. Just turn on any news channel. They're either telling us about the travesties out there, or they're lying about what's going on. We are a people who cannot help but get in our own way when it comes to serving and following God. And so we're going to need something dazzling. We're going to need something wonderful. We're going to need the transfiguration to keep the faith and to keep following the Lord. See, we're going to need this mountaintop experience, just like these men did, that reveals the Son of God in majesty and in holiness and in purity. And we're going to need God to share those attributes of Himself with us. If not, we are doomed. And we're going to need a person who is the fulfillment of the law. And that is represented by Moses. Moses and Elijah met Jesus. And notice, they didn't become dazzling white, and their clothes didn't become like flashes of lightning. No, only Jesus. And when it was all said and done, when they finally lifted up their heads after they were terrified, they didn't see Moses and Elijah. They only saw Jesus. We're going to need the mountaintop experience. We're going to need a person who is the fulfillment of the law, and that is represented by Moses, who brought down God's law to the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. And just as Jesus said to everybody, He said, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And we're going to need a person who fulfills all the prophecies of God's anointed one, the Messiah. And this is really represented by both Moses and Elijah. They were probably the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. They were both God's spokesmen. And see, we're going to need someone on whom God's approval rests, and who vouches for this man who, quite frankly, says some outlandish and crazy things. They're simple sometimes, and yet they're very profound. And they can shake us to the core. Because Jesus says things like, whoever wants to save his life must lose it. But whoever loses his life for me and the gospel, he will save it. You see, we need the Son of Man when we are cowering on the ground and with unspeakable fear after we beheld the glory of God and the majesty of God. We're going to need someone to touch us with His firm and forgiving hand and command us, as one of the gospel writers said. Jesus touched them and said, "Get up and be not afraid." We can look at the news right now sometimes and we can become afraid. Whether it's a shooting at a church, or violence in the streets, or wars in other parts of the world that you think might spill over into our land. We don't know. But we need the transfiguration. Because we of little faith, we have the audacity to pull Jesus aside and say, what you are saying, Jesus, is crazy. No, you can't die. And Jesus says to Peter, He says, you do not have in mind the things of God. You have in your mind the things of man. And that's why, when we have the things of man in our mind, that's when we're in trouble. Too often we have the things of man. So we need the transfiguration to get us to the resurrection. I'm going to say that. Those men needed the transfiguration to get to the resurrection. We need that cloud to appear to us and envelop us and tell us that we are on the right path when it comes to following the Messiah. And that when we have our doubts and our fears and our apprehensions, all we need to do is go to God in prayer and read His Word, and says, listen to Him, the Father says. Listen to Him and obey Him. Jesus' resurrection is 2,000 years in our rearview mirror now. And our resurrection is still in the future, right? Our resurrection will happen on the day that the trumpet sounds and the God of the universe beckons the dead in Christ to rise. And only the Father in heaven knows when that will be. So we are grateful for the transfiguration, because it makes Christ's resurrection even more real and addresses and gives us that extra taste of glory that we have because of the Holy Spirit in our lives. That's part of the taste of our glory that is to come. As usual, God was lovingly thinking of us when the Father transfigured His Son. God was thinking of us. He knows us better than we know ourselves, that we cannot stay on the mountaintop forever. We'll have to descend and live a life that is full of challenges and trials and unfulfilled dreams and other things I don't even want to verbalize. But God, through the transfiguration, gives us a glimpse of our future with Him. And it's beyond good. It's life-altering. And as Mark says, or one of them says, it's dazzling.